Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 98 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, my guest is Dr. Annetta Alexandridis, a professor of art history at Cornell. She studies the art and archaeology of ancient Greece and Rome with a particular interest in gender studies, animal studies, and the media of archaeology. Her current book project focuses on concepts of humans and animals and interrogates how boundaries between both were negotiated in Greek mythological imagery and medical writings. She is an associate director of the Harvard-Cornell Exploration of Sardis in Turkey. There, she co-conducts a survey of the cemeteries to trace the social history of this ancient city at the crossroads between East and West. At Cornell, she co-curates the plaster cast collection with Dr. Verity Platt and is also responsible for the coin collection. In this episode, we discussed her experience working on a Roman villa and navigating different archaeological sites, the benefits of working with casts and material culture, defining archaeology, how the field has changed, and determining who gets to define its meaning. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I was really excited about this conversation, and I hope to start you off with what I hope will be a very easy question. And that's, when did you discover your passion for studying the ancient world?
Yeah, it's almost embarrassing. I can't remember that I ever wanted to do anything else. I always wanted to become an archaeologist. I think even the teacher at primary school said, you are not able to tell what your parents were doing for a living, but I knew what I wanted to do. I guess I've never evolved from that, right? So I can't even remember what the trigger moment was, right? And I have to say, I did not immediately sort of focus or was only interested in the classical world, sort of Greek and Roman archaeology. I loved the dinosaurs. We would go to the natural history museums every Sunday. I loved Egypt. And it was always, I think, also exhibitions that over time like nurtured this more and more. And then maybe because we also often went to Greece, then eventually I stayed with Greece and Rome, and also the place where I grew up. So I grew up in Germany. The city is Heidelberg. This was the Germania Superior province of the Roman Empire. So there were remnants, right, in the area, not splendid ones, but basically the limes, the border of the Roman Empire. It was a ditch, and I kind of hated it, but it was still the ancient world, right? And so in a way, it was never totally gone, and I guess that's what maybe made me focus on Greece and Rome. Although, again, I don't remember any sort of trigger moment, it was always there somehow.
Well, that's good. I mean, for a lot of us, I think we just come to the ancient world somehow, don't remember, but then you sort of have this weird memory of like, well, I always loved it. So for most of us, me included, I feel like, yeah, there wasn't a trigger moment, but there was definitely a time where you kind of make the decision, like, this is what I want to study in school. So for you, when was that moment in school of being like, this is what I want to do, and this is what will let me go do that?
I certainly think it has to do with then high school, where I went to what the Germans call a humanistic high school, humanistisches Gymnasium. So with Latin, we started with Latin, and then English, and then ancient Greek. So the Latin teacher was one who always turned this also into sort of a cultural history, right? And yeah, I think from that point on, it was totally clear that I would go on with this path.
And a question that I am always very interested in for those, who go into the classical world is, when or how did it come down to making the decision between focusing on Greece or Rome?
That's also interesting. I kind of, as I just said, I kind of despised, with this Latin teacher, we would go out, and every free excursion day was visiting the Limes or some Villa Rustica, or go out and measure Roman watchtowers. I thought this terrible. So it had to be either Rome, the center, or Greece, where we, also for family visits, would regularly go. And so I was certainly focused on Greece from the beginning on. Actually, it started when I really studied in archaeology that I realized that the whole thing is like more interesting. Even the first excavation I went to, well, the second one actually in Olympia, where I was convinced I would, find Greek little geometric horses, and the excavation director explains to me, so we are going to excavate actually a Roman villa. And first I thought, no, don't, no. And then I realized how exciting it is actually, right? Roman Greece. This was in the early 90s. So this was also the time when within the discipline, this became a topic. Before, people would also say, why should we look at Rome in Greece, right? So yeah, understood certainly more once I really started to study, right? Instead of just thinking about it, right? Sort of from my holiday experiences.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's funny because what you were describing, I was like, oh man, that would have been a crushing bait and switch for me, I think, if I was like, yes, I want little horses. And then if they say, nope, Roman villa. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, I also would have been like, okay, cool, let's do this. But at the same time, I think, at least for me, I was very much always a Hellenist. So the Roman stuff didn't really interest me. So I would have been kind of sad to switch. But yeah, I mean, so what was that like being able to really sort of get the hands-on experience and work on this Roman villa and did this kind of cement your passion really, let's say, to stick with the more material culture, archaeology side? Did you ever have any doubts where you were like, well, maybe I could sort of do texts and be a philologist, or was it always like, no, I want the material culture?
I think I was always more a material culture person, which I now regret. I mean, I have to say, so the system in Germany is also different. You cannot specialize from the beginning on, but you had to be, so you had your major, which was classical archaeology, that's what it was called at the time, and then two minors. So the one was art history, and the other one had to be either one of the philologies, Latin or Greek, or ancient history. And I chose ancient history. If I had been totally free, I would have chosen Egyptology. This was much more my interest. Again, another culture. And it's now with the research interest change also with before in certain departments when you have, it's just the people you meet that make you think differently. So I really had great colleagues also back in Rostock at that time in Germany, philologists, and I thought, damn it, I should have continued this more. I mean, it became interesting, right? I mean, at school I loved it, of course, Greek and Latin, but I didn't think I wanted to study it sort of as a philology or literature. Maybe I didn't really think of it as literature so much than translation, right? I mean, word by word. I don't know what it was. I mean, I felt I was certainly more interested in the material culture, right? And so that the excavation didn't change that. I mean, it made me think in other ways. It showed me that excavation is not. I thought this is of the more immediate access, right? You really find the things in the earth. But then so often you dig and you realize, wait a minute, this has already been excavated. There were traces of the earlier excavation from the 19th century. And so you realize how complicated these layers are. And the immediate access is kind of an illusion, and it needs to be there to keep you going, I think. But you need to learn that there is a constant, also a kind of translation work going on, right? Yeah, but that made it in the end more difficult, but also more interesting, I would say. Yeah.
Well, it's always fascinating to hear a little bit about how foreign countries, foreign institutions kind of structure programs and, what they may or may not make students choose or focus on. It's interesting because there's certain aspects of the European schools that I like where they'll sort of make you focus. And then there's obviously parts that I don't love. So then in programs here in the US, you'll have a lot more time to sort of choose and the freedom to kind of go outside of just one area. So I suppose, yeah, pros and cons to both having studied in both systems.
The freedom for us, I would say, back in Germany is because you don't pay or not too much. So I would choose classes from all sorts of other disciplines, philosophy or whatever, also things that had nothing to do or whatever, try to learn Russian or just sit in, right? It wasn't immediately a financial burden or something. But still, the structure was there for what you had to do to finish your BA or MA then in this one discipline. And what I see here is there is more encouragement, it's not so much the classes, well, also the classes you take, but within the classes, there is more of a encouragement for students to think more broadly, right? And not in a specialist way. Maybe it's also because you have in the undergrads from all sorts of disciplines there. So I learned from them, right? This is really super exciting. And I'm always amazed also how this must be the school system in the United States. Students, even those who have really no clue about a field, immediately or relatively quickly get to the problematic issues or the interesting questions, right? Sort of structurally or conceptually. That's certainly something we did not learn. I mean, either you know your stuff, right, and then you can talk, or otherwise you learn, yeah. But rather sort of think about it on a sort of meta level. How can I say? That's something I think you can really learn. One should learn, and that I see this with the students here all the time. So in a way, in the whole system of school education and then the scholarly system in the universities, it makes more sense to me ultimately, right, than back what I experience in Germany, or even worse, I have to say, I started in France. This was like positivism, I mean, to the extreme, So, yeah. But it, again, constantly made me think, again, it's a way of translation, right? I mean, how also the way you learn is a form of cultural translation in the end, right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's interesting because, what I've been hearing is, you have a lot of different interests and you wanted to create room for yourself to try to pursue and just sort of explore other places that aren't so pigeonholed. And I think it's really interesting because it's very reflective, right? And kind of like the work that you've been able to do since then. Because as I was kind of doing my research and preparation, I was like, wow, you have your hand in a lot. I think I saw some gender studies, some animal studies, some, history of the media of archaeology and stuff like that, all kind of in there. And then I think I like saw coins in there. So I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's so cool. That's like a lot of stuff. Can you tie it together for those of us who, if you're in the field, you kind of understand how these things go and how you find things that seem like they don't really have anything that are related to each other. But for maybe the general audience who it might be a little confusing, like how do you weave together like the animal stuff with the coins and other things? Can you talk about how these interests kind of came together?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly confusing, and for me, maybe too, from time to time. And sometimes you lose yourself in these different interests. But I always think that maybe it has to do with the fact that I never had this one trigger moment, what interests antiquity or something, and that's why I want to go this way. Somehow, I feel that the themes came to me. This general interest that somehow, there are always remnants of the ancient world there, whether it be like material ones. That was maybe the first thing I was thinking about, but then it was often from a contemporary moment that I started to think, wait a minute, how was this actually back then, right? So my dissertation, for example, on the women of the Roman imperial house, where I have to say I did not really dig too much into gender studies. I mean, this also because that kind of theoretical training came later. But still, I think one of the triggers was, this early 90s back in Europe, there are all these, queens. The queen still was alive, right? The Dutch queen and the Danish queen both have abdicated now, but no democratically elected political female leader, right? And then the other side, you go to most prominently Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto, or then I even remember Turkey, Tansu Çiller. These countries that in my superficial thing sort of view was like, well, in countries where there is no gender equality, and the women rise to power, and why not in Germany, right? And that was the moment to think, wait a minute, how did this actually, I mean, there are all these imperial women in the Roman Empire, what is their function and role, how was it defined, etc. And that was the moment, right? Then later in the 90s, huge discussions about what's the real boundary between humans and animals. And then, people discover, well, humans and fruit flies share a lot of DNA actually. So you can't say there's a categorical difference, language or something, right? And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, how was this in antiquity? in the end, ex post, however, I have to say, sometimes you make sense of your life, right? The things are connected because I realized that discourses on gender and on animals overlap a lot, right? And so, the things in a way, or the body, makes sense. The coins and everything has to do with, I'm really not a numismatist or coin expert. This has to do with my interest, of course, in collections and the media of archaeology. So wherever I taught, I was also interested in the collections that were in place. And here at Cornell, where I teach, there is a coin collection. So I kind of took care of it, and I'm still learning, right? So it's a process, right?
Well, and for those who may not be familiar with what that means, can you explain what the media of archaeology is?
So the way I use it for myself is that, of course, you have to visualize, and also, especially in places where you're not close to the source material, right? You need instruments or tools that kind of help you to do your research. And a very old tool of that kind, and that certainly comes from the art historical tradition of classical archaeology, are plaster casts of ancient sculpture. Again, big tradition in Germany that basically every department of classical archaeology has a plaster cast collection, right? That, of course, narrows your view of the ancient world if you only look at sculptures, right, and of sort of ideal figures or portraits, etc., but leaves out a lot of, like, let's say, shards, right, and the more daily life things. Anyway, this is one medium, and what I wanted my students to understand when we work with these objects, and I think that I also constantly work with and have to learn about, is that on the one side, it provides you with some sort of primary, like more real hands-on material. You don't only work with text or photographs. The term would always be, it's a laboratory. But on the other side, it also, of course, shapes the way you think about your discipline, right? And your discipline and about the things you are working on. So the plaster cast in particular, and this is also something I only realized fully, probably never will fully realize, but more recently, how much these plaster casts have shaped ideas about race, right? Where I would think this is just they're sort of innocent, they just are copies of an ancient object, and also help, a more sustainable or ethically unproblematic way to get hands on ancient objects or sculptures. Yeah, you don't take them into your home country, but you take a cast and take this one. But the replication and circulation and wide circulation of these plaster casts have certainly spread a certain idea of the body of the human as such that turns out to be, the Greek body, right? And then it gets problematic. Also, the color question. Casts are white. And I would always say, well, this has nothing to do with skin color. This is abstract. It's the material of the plaster. But exactly this abstractness, right, that then stands in for man as such, makes this connection, because black cannot be abstract in that sense. It never can be, right? And so these things, I honestly, also, it took me ages to fully understand, right? Why people here, of course, always say, well, these are white, white people. No, they are not. But in the end, at least from a certain point of view, for those who started to work with and look at these plaster casts starting in the especially 18th century, in the end, these were white people, right? Again, the interesting thing about the media of archaeology is that they are working tools, right? But then they also, in a way, shape, in the end, the material you work on, in sometimes uncanny and more subtle way. And it's not always easy to be aware of this, or, you should train yourself, or, to critically work with them, let's say, right?
It's interesting because as you started talking about casts, I realized that my alma mater, where I did my undergrad, University of Missouri, we had a
Oh, you have a famous collection. Yeah, in the
yeah, we
museum.
have a really interesting, good collection. Yeah, exactly. At our Museum of like Art History and Archaeology, we do have quite a collection of plaster casts, and so I was lucky that we would be able to go and see the collection either for class or outside of it. But they're very white, and I know this is very problematic, and so considering that we have the opinions we do now, and we see how problematic it is, in your opinion, why do you think it is that we don't paint our casts more?
I don't know whether it's sort of a general attitude. I discuss this often with my colleagues and also with my students. What can we do to fight this idea? First of all, that the ancient statues were white or only marble color. I mean, there are enough attempts. And honestly, where I studied in Munich, we had these people who organized the more recent color show in New York, were actually graduate students at the time in Munich when I started to study. So I grew up with the idea that these things were painted. So it was never so new to me. But I think you also don't want to, and that was also a critique of the exhibition, right? There are so many color studies now. You also want to not sort of canonize again one idea of how the color was, how the colored pieces look. And that's also great again with the cast. You can use them as really for experiments. I mean, you take several copies. I mean, it's a money question, but you take several copies of the same piece and try out different versions. What I personally would not want to push aside is that these casts, when they were originally made, were supposed to be white, because that was the tradition of thinking in most cases, right? Where, I mean, scholars even deliberately fought the idea that ancient sculpture would have been painted for ideological reasons. And I don't want this to be forgotten, right? I mean, first of all, it's also a history part of neoclassicism, so they have to be white, but I also want students to keep that in mind. Also, the cast is not only a substitute for the original, right? It's an object in its own right. And as such, I think it has to be white. That's sort of the 18th, 19th century tradition. And I think one should keep all of these possibilities open and at play at the same time, just to be able to criticize, right, but also understand the historical context. That might be a reason for why, I mean, at least in my case, why I'm not sure that I want it, because especially if you only have one cast, that I want to have it painted. We did it once with an example where we had two casts of the same bust, and a student tried out to paint one bust to give an idea of how this might have looked, right? Then it works. Another option would be, you project colors onto the cast. That would be, I think, a nice way to show. I think the most important thing is to keep things flexible. Never give the impression that this is how it was, right? That's the one right way.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. And I think that is kind of a part of the argument that we forget, that gets lost when we talk about, especially when it gets so much into, kind of about ideologies and stuff. People sort of lose the idea that like there was actually a reason that people wanted them to be white and that they needed and so you bring up a lot of good points kind of regarding, you have to look at the whole history and context and see, people wanted them to be so. Why did they want them to be so? Is there a value in this? But, the other thing about casts that I've always thought was very interesting is that obviously I understand for the monetary reasons, a lot of times there's only one cast made. But in the event where you can get multiple, if it's something that's able to be done, one thing that I've always kind of found frustrating, but like I understand on some level because just as a classicist myself, like I know things, but there's this idea that archaeology is supposed to be the more hands-on thing where you're supposed to really be able to touch the thing, look at the material culture. And so when you have a case where there's multiple, not just one, it sort of annoys me that I've definitely gone to like museums or places where they say, oh yes, and we have 2 or we have 3 of these. Like they're just kind of locked away somewhere. And I'm kind of a big proponent of, I mean, I know it's kind of childish, but like I love the kids sections in museums where you have things you can touch and you can hold and really sort of see its uses. And so, when you have a couple different casts. I understand that casts are like an object in it of themselves, but I'm also like, if you have multiple, why can't you let just one of them be for us to like touch, So is this something that you think about when you look at material culture? Is this something that doesn't really come up because is it, oh no, that's like for a kid exhibit? Is it scarcity of resources? Like, what is it? Because I definitely find myself going into museums being like, you have more than one. I want to touch this. Why won't you let me touch one of your many copies?
Yeah, this is wonderful. Spot on with the discussion that I have with my students right now. I'm teaching with the collection, but can I just go back to one thing, the whiteness of the cast? I think something specific, and I felt is different from my experience in Germany, is that these classical or neoclassical aesthetic with the whiteness of the cast that, are Greek or Roman, and it's not only the figures, also the columns, etc., are so foundational for the United States because it's the aesthetics of the founding of the country, right? That's different. I mean, when I came here, I was so surprised that every house has these classical columns. I mean, it's kind of nice, and interesting. And of course, it looks also, again, different and it's sort of playful, but I thought, wow, I wasn't used to this, right? Tradition in here. Touching. Yeah, of course, everybody wants to do this. And I remember for a time, this was the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. This was a time where it was big to have sort of, they really called it touchstones, fragments of originals even, of the sculptures, like a little piece where visitors were invited to touch it. I think at a certain point, and certainly at the latest with the pandemic, these things were off, you don't want to touch where everybody else. Although, I mean, this is how it works with relics, etc., all the time. With the casts, they break easily. I sort of care for the casts, so therefore I would be more reluctant, let's say, right, to have this happen. Although when we worked with the casts and had students clean them, restore them, they enjoyed it thoroughly, that they could touch them and stuff, right? Back in Germany, I used allowed student to touch casts. I remember one case, we had a blind student and she was in philology, but she wanted to do something in archaeology. And my philologist said, yeah, that's great. And you can translate this into Braille, etc. But I don't know, how can I translate this three-dimensional sculpture into the text, Then I gave her gloves and had her, and it was super interesting. With the others, we had this sort of, we call it Übungen, a sort of tutorial. You go to the cast collection and then describe what is it, how would you date it, etc. And there she was, and just experienced these objects with her hands. And she was so much better than the rest of the group. She saw things that the others did not grasp. I mean, it was crazy, right? And that is, in a way, it speaks in your favor that the touching, yeah, we maybe have lost the sense of touch because everything is so visual. I think also, this time, in no other period in human history, I think, you can really say this, have people been surrounded by images like all over, available, like, and especially on a flat screen. So the sense of three-dimensionality and touching has been lost a little bit. So yeah, maybe I should rethink my idea, right? And at least with gloves or something, let people touch the cast. In this class that I teach about our own collections, there is, of course, the thing, shall the students wear gloves when they work with the objects, and I think we'll do it for some, but it's kind of weird because as an archaeologist in the field, I wear gloves. No, you're touching everything, right? And then at the moment it's in the drawer in the collection, you feel like, maybe it's a different status now, right? It's a debate, even among museum people, should you not, or when and stuff. But I agree that the touch is an important thing that visitors should be able to experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument with casts, obviously, for many reasons that you've said, they are delicate, they could break. Like, obviously, we don't want to break the cast because it stems from, I took in my freshman year, I signed up for a class on Greek art and archaeology. And my professor, who ended up being one of my very favorite professors, favorite people, and she's an expert in Greek archaeology at Corinth and the figurines there. So just love her. It's Dr. Susan Langdon. So she was my favorite professor. And I remember just being so impressed because it was this first or second early on in the semester. And she said, okay, I have a treat for you guys. I am bringing in 2 original objects that we have probably our museum. One was one of those ceremonial daggers with the lion hunts on it, the sort of designs.
Oh. These were from the shaft graves in Mycenae. Maybe these were these electrotype replicas. We have those too. These daggers with, they are these guillerons father and son. They made all these replicas. It's, also restored or reconstructed them, but they're super, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so we had one of the daggers, heavy bronze, and we were all very impressed. And then she had sort of like, I remember it was like an old bronze kylix to show us, this is how drinking culture would go, and I want you to feel how heavy this would have been. And so she was like, it's not like these light plastic things that you just shoot, you know. And I just remember, so she brought those in. We had the gloves, and then we put on the gloves and passed these around. And I just remember it being so interesting and important, I think, that set the tone for that class. And so I just remember thinking, well, we don't need original or really great copies. We don't need the actual object, but, something like this and would be great. But, one of the wonderful things with modern technology that we have now that we didn't even have when I was an undergrad in 2013, 14, whatever that was. We have a lot more like 3D printing stuff. And I was in a conversation with someone earlier this month about how they like 3D printed a whole copy of ancient Knossos, like a whole 3D model. And so if casts are kind of delicate and they are also objects, as someone who does like visuals and archaeology, what about 3D printing versions of objects so that way you can experiment, you can paint them, color them, you could not, but you can give people something they can touch, and it's replicable because you just print the 3D file and everyone can have one.
Yeah, no, this is certainly a way to go. I remember a colleague of mine try to do it. But also, this technology changes so quickly, and I remember that the student who was supposed to scan this one vessel, I mean, she sat there for days, and then it didn't capture all the details, and still the old casting mold. And since I'm a traditional person, I thought, yeah, I knew it, this will never be as good. But in the end, I think you are right. And if only for these heuristic reasons, right? I mean, to try out things, you can learn from that. I agree. Yeah, this should be certainly something that to explore more. Yeah. Bringing objects to class is always the best thing. I think students really like it. I mean, as you just described it, this physical experience, right? Weight, as you just mentioned, is something that you cannot, and especially with the daily life object, right? It also makes you ask different questions of how this was used and for whom, etc. Especially with these drinking vessels, on the other side, we have these terracotta, clay vessels, that are so light. Everybody who has ever tried to make a pot is always surprised how light this stuff is. Everything we do here is like clumsy and heavy, right? So again, something you only experience when you really try to lift it, right? Or hold it a little bit, for sure. Thankfully, we are usually still relatively small in our classes, so that it's easy to make this happen, right? In small groups. I wonder for bigger classes, you probably really have to rely on these 3D scan things, like that are more easily, less dangerous to handle or delicate to handle.
I mean, there's no right or wrong. I think there's just how much effort do we want to put in? How much can we put in? Unfortunately, not all schools are created equal. So some may easily be able to have, I don't know, if you're lucky, you'll have a couple of casts lying around. If you're not, you probably would only have access to the 3D printing material. A lot of places can't bring in real objects because they may not have a museum attached. So
yeah, no, for sure, for sure.
it's just fascinating to think about. But it's funny because we've been talking a lot about archaeology, a lot about this, sort of, for many people, potentially new world of media of archaeology. I've brought up the fact that when people sort of think of archaeology, it's like the hands-on thing where you're like, okay, I'm going to get in the dirt and I'm going to look at the thing. I don't think I've ever asked anyone on my podcast, and I don't know why. So I'm going to ask you, you get to be first. What is the actual definition of archaeology? Because I realized I was writing an article talking a lot about archaeology in video games. And I got a research interview with somebody who was from the gaming side. And I sort of asked them, okay, like, what is archaeology? And they gave me an answer that was so
far from correct, but I realized that it's also a very valid assumption if you don't actually know what the definition of archaeology is. I think he just said it's like looking at the past through oral history, something, but it was not what it is.
Material.
Yeah. So I want to clear this up for people.
Well, I think, it's again, so many different fields have found their own way to define it, right? The hands-on people, some people would even say that I'm not an archaeologist, I'm more an art historian, because most of my research is not digging up the things and analyzing what I find in the soil. But I would still say it's scholarship about or research about ancient things, and then this, whether you find them in the dirt or standing around, right? Then, and this is where sort of the more metaphorical levels eventually might come in, that you dig up strata, right? Psychologists would also use that in a way, certain layers of the past, or experience, one by one. And this does not necessarily have to have for us, it has a material, physical component, but it can also be just, imagined. I remember this must have been 2000 or something, where with Foucault, the term became so important that some of these theorists, that was back in Germany, would even say, man, this is like the guiding metaphor for all the humanities, and you archaeologists, you should be so happy, it's you, and then they were generally talking about archaeology as this sort of, I don't remember exactly how they said it, but the different things, assemblages, but don't try to make sense of it. Don't try to just describe the fragments. That's it, and we were like, no way, this is not us, So there's the same role. This is not archaeology, Okay, yeah, each discipline, I think, has their different, again, way to think about it, right? I mean, if you just go to the Greek term, it's about the logia, the things, think about, right? Speak about the ancient stuff. I think even in the original, as we think, sort of passage in Thucydides, where they find tombs, is it of Carians, I think, on Delos or something, where he says from the way these objects looked in the tombs, you can sort of realize what's no longer, or those that are no longer there, sort of on top of the earth, right? Once were here. And he says similar things about cities, but in weird ways, where sometimes he works with different parameters. On the one side, the ruins of cities say, how big these ones were, but at the same time, they also say that everything is perishable and there is no grandeur that lasts, or something like this. Just wanted to say that even the ancient term in different contexts, is used differently, right?
I asked because I intentionally sort of mean it to highlight that there isn't one specific definition, and it does depend very much on, what is your background, what are you coming from, how do you look at it? But it's just interesting because it serves to kind of strengthen your point is, the definition that I would say I normally use, right, is the definition offered by the Society for American Archaeology, which obviously is going to be very different than like a European society. According to their website, because I use this in my paper, is that they offer a very short definition. And the first line of their What is Archaeology page says, archaeology is the study of the ancient and recent human past through material remains. So you're like, oh, that makes sense. But also, that's really broad because that says nothing about archaeological sites. That does not say where or what. It just says material remains, which means as an art historian, human remains. There's a lot of like human art floating around. That could be the cave paintings in France. That's, portraits in ancient Greece and Egypt and Rome. And so it's interesting because I like that one because it's very broad. And it means that to me, it's more welcoming. I mean, the thing it stresses, right, is it's got to be material remains. And so I'm like, okay, any material remnants. But then it's interesting because I remember I got that definition and then I was like, I wonder if I could find a different one that says something more explicit. And so I did a little Google search right after I got my definition, and I went to like dictionary.com. And it's very interesting because that one says that archaeology is the study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. And I'm like, well, that one's more explicit because that one says it has to be sites. It does still say, it has the same sort of physical remains and artifacts, but it's interesting how these two definitions differ. And I realized, but that could lead people down different ideas of what this discipline is based on, do you go by, the official society for archaeology, or do you go by like dictionary.com, which I feel like normal people, if they're just going to Google what is archaeology, and that's the first thing that comes up under dictionary, I feel like people are going to be like, yep, that's the one. I love how these different definitions kind of illustrate your point that it's different based on kind of what your experience is.
I think it's very important that you emphasize, and I didn't say this before, of course, the emphasis on the material remains, whatever type these are, right? And even there, I think sometimes people might think in more metaphorical ways of things that are just imagined and don't have maybe something really like a material side to it. But I would still say you are right. This is the tipping point. And interestingly, back in the day when archaeology was sort of emancipating itself as a independent or discipline within classics, it was basically in Germany, particularly it was called philology of things. You see that the model of philology has shaped the classical Greco-Roman archaeology to a really broad extent. And I realized this myself. I mean, it really brought it home to me when I was co-teaching a class on producing fabric with my colleague Kaya McGowan, who is an expert in Southeast Asian art. And so we did this sort of alternating, right? And one class was up to me and her, so our interest was sort of the metaphors of producing fabric, but it was crazy because there we have two cultures, thousands of kilometers apart, thousands of years apart. But also methodologically, I realized how much of a philologist I am. I had my texts, and we classified things and put them in order like a grammar of how to read it. And Kaya said, well, they were just doing things. Students had to also, as preparation, they had to spin the wool, they had to weave something. It's a little bit what you brought up earlier with the touching. It's a different approach. Different questions come up, right? And the goosebump moment was, of course, to realize that the metaphors were the same, right? But we had approached it from, on every respect, different levels. But again, it showed me, and you could say this is also an archaeology, but this worked differently, right? The one is more the one that comes more as from a philological side, the other more, they would say, anthropological side. Right?
Well, I'd love to ask like 1,000 more questions because I find these topics so fascinating. But unfortunately, neither of us have time for that. So I am going to move us along, unfortunately, because, darn it. So I know it's different in Europe. So instead of asking the standard questions, I'm going to say, when you were in school in Germany, was there a kind of office hours that you had over there?
There were office hours, but you are totally right. This was very different. This was certainly not a moment to go in and chat with the professor. You would not use up their time that way. You would usually go to eventually the so-called assistant professors, let's say. They would maybe help you with more formal things, credit questions or something like that. Otherwise, especially as an undergraduate, especially in my discipline, again, it was small, it was one department and we were all in a building. So you would more easily bump into your professor or see them in the library and could eventually ask something like this. But it was certainly not, I would not sit in and just want to chat, no way. I wouldn't dare to. And therefore, I'm always so disappointed. The students sometimes, especially after the pandemic for whatever, don't come to my office hours anymore because of the kids. It's such a privilege, And I honestly, when I came here first, I also thought, why are these kids sitting here, and talking to me about all sorts of things but I more and more enjoy it, and I learn so much, especially because they all come from so many different backgrounds in every respect, and it's really interesting conversation. So I only can say, please come, because I can explain things via email or on Canvas, but it's always easier to do it in an immediate conversation because then I see every individual reads my text slightly differently, right? Or has a slightly different, and it's for me, it's easier to solve these problems on a one-to-one basis, right?
Well, you just answered that second question, which was like, why do you think they're important? So you already answered it. So I'll just move us along. But yeah, no, I heartily agree. And I'm a very strong proponent for office hours. So definitely I'm going to encourage all of your students and any students anywhere, go to office hours. Your professors would like to talk to you. They're very nice people. Most of them are. Anyway, at the end of each podcast, I ask if each guest will read Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And now today, for this episode, we have a very fun special request coming in, and that is to read the poem in German. And I'm very excited because we don't get a lot of these foreign language poem readings. But yes, please read us the poem in German. And then after you've read the poem, if you could just tell us, what do you think about this poem? Do you agree that, it's awesome and cool? And or do you not like the poem? I mean, just what does this poem make you think of?
Yeah.
The Ozymandias Project's digital magazine, Pnyx, is hosting a write-a-thon. You can write whatever you want pertaining to the ancient world, but if you need any help, we'll have some prompts and we'll be there to help along the way. Feel free to join at any point from now until the end of August. Submissions from the write-a-thon will be published in the fall 2024 edition of Pnyx. Visit our website for more information and guidelines about the write-a-thon. A link is in the show notes. We are also still accepting rolling submissions to Pnyx separate from the write-a-thon.
Ein Wanderer kam aus einem alten Land und sprach: Ein riesig Trümmerbild von Stein steht in der Wüste, rumpflos, Bein an Bein, das Haupt daneben, halb verdeckt vom Sand. Der Züge Trotz belehrt uns, wohl verstand der Bildner jenes eitlen Hohnesschein zu lesen, der in toten Stoff hinein geprägt den Stempel seiner ehernen Hand. Und auf dem Sockel steht die Schrift: Mein Name ist Ozymandias, aller Könge König. Seht meine Werke, Mächt'ge, und erbebt. Nichts weiter blieb. Ein Bild von düstrem Grame dehnt um die Trümmer endlos, kahl, eintönig die Wüste sich, die den Koloss begräbt. So this is a translation by a certain Adolf Strothmann from 1866. I found several translations. Others were more closer to the text, more literal, and certainly more poignant in certain aspects. But I think the rhyming, I thought was important for getting me into this mood that there is something gone and a ruin, right? It's a different way of talking. It's not just, the prose text, so to speak. I have to admit that, there you see, I'm coming from a different country. I was not really familiar with this poem, so that I had to really get into this a little bit in preparation for this conversation, and I'm really grateful for it, Lexi. Really, I thought it's super interesting, and maybe I'm reading it too much now through these different translations also. So this Adolf Strothmann was apparently a revolutionary in Germany in the 19th century who tried to argue for a unified Germany, no monarchies, etc. The other one that I found that have not read was made by an anarchist from the 1920s, after World War I. And what I really read into this is, even if it gets you into this mood of the old world and ruins always have something romantic for me, there is this deep satisfaction, that the oppressor has been smashed. And and it's just basically pathetic what remains, So I read it more as a kind of, in a way, revolutionary almost, subtle, more or less subtle message. I also find it interesting, again, since we talked about translation before, there are so many levels, again, the never being able to directly access the past, right? There's a traveler from the past. Who is that? Who tells you something. And then also this inscription, that sort of is, and the inscription reads, how the hell do you know what the inscription reads? What the text says if you cannot read the text? We assume, I'm thinking of course, this example with Ramses, and it would have been hieroglyphics. How could you think you can decipher what it says or really understand the past? So in the end, it's also, I think, for me, a poem that it might be our impression that we say, you know, the oppressor has been smashed, but maybe it was completely different if we just read it differently, right? Because there's so much we don't understand, right? Or we don't know. We can try and maybe should, and it's also exciting, but there's so much that remains elusive.
I really love that, the more I have people read the poem, and I think my favorite, honestly, episodes are with those who were not previously familiar with the poem, because I get fascinating new takes, and I've really not thought of this as a sort of revolutionary text, but it's brilliant. It's true. Because, when I normally read it, I'm like, yes, it's a political statement by Shelley, the time he was writing it. I mean, think about what was going on in England at this point. And, for me, it's always kind of sad because I'm like, oh, it's a memento mori. It's here to just be like, oh, the nature of all powers, that it'll go away, and then you're left sad. But the revolutionary aspect brings almost like a more hopeful sort of note to it. So it doesn't have to be just sad and depressing all the time. So I love that take. I mean, I think it may be one of my favorites because wow, that really just pow with my brain.
Now that you said, if I can add this, it made me, now that you said this sort of getting rid of the past, this brings me back to the plaster casts, because the plaster casts, at a certain point, late 19th century, early 20th century, they had started that people wanted to get rid of them because they were everywhere. And there's this fundamentally this futurist manifesto by Marinetti, where he says, get rid of all the museums and all the archaeologists. I mean, it's not only the cast, it's also the originals, and smash them, etc. And this is what happened with the plaster casts. And I honestly, as much as I love them, I can't understand that this is a moment of liberation. And with my colleague, Lorenz Winkel-Horacek in Berlin, with whom I co-edited this book on the plaster cast, he organized this, an event in the cast collection there, where they had an actor read several texts about how casts were perceived differently from neoclassicism to the 20th century, where there are these texts, and it would be, a deed of Caesarean dimensions if you would throw them all in the river Spree, or give them to the departments of art history where they do the least damage. But in a way, get rid of them. And so the actor read it, and they had bought a relatively cheap cast of a figure from the Erechtheion, one of these caryatids, and he pushed it and smashed it. And the audience was like, and he knew that it was happening, but he said he himself, there's the moment thing, how? But on the other side, afterwards, he said, it comes with a certain satisfaction,
Oh my goodness.
So that's what I see here, smashed and boundless and bare, and the wreck, the colossal wreck and stuff.
I mean, it's great language. It's super metaphorical, but it's visual, but it's, oh my gosh, this is all the things of why I love this poem. I mean, I always think I couldn't love it more. And then of course someone reads it and then brings a new dimension. And then I'm like, I love it more. How is this possible to love something that I've honestly had with me since I don't remember if I read it in high school or college first. I think it was high school, but all I know is that it's been my favorite poem for many, many years now. And every new reading kind of justifies why. I'm like, yes, this makes me feel very secure in saying this is the best. But, having talked about all these great themes, the last question I ask every single guest, thinking about the themes of the poem and what this kind of means, is there a modern Ozymandias, a modern equivalent, something we think is great and amazing and will last forever, but like realistically, humans in 200-300 years from now, will they agree with us? Will they sort of disagree with us? Will they think, oh man, these past humans were insane. What were they thinking?
What I mean, I'm saying this now, it's sort of, it might be totally off, but while reading this, and again with the idea that there are these ruins of some past ruler or civilization that we maybe cannot really understand. I was thinking about what I had to think about at this moment, where Nevada in the desert, all these nuclear deposits, where scholars try to come up with a colleague of mine, Andrew Moisey, gave this talk about it for a while ago, try to send a message to the future generations in 10,000 years. don't go near this. If you see what they came up with, it's totally ridiculous. This, of course, it's with bone function. And as an archaeologist anyway, I can say this is the first thing you would dig up. The monstrosity of, on the one side, the bomb and the material and the whole, scientific, if you want, progress or discoveries, right? And then it destroys itself to a certain extent. And this moment that you won't be able to communicate this to in 10,000 years, it's monumental and scary, Yeah, I don't know. It's probably not really what you were asking for, but these were sort of my associations in thinking about this. Yeah.
No, it's totally valid. Perfect answer. And I kind of lied. There is one last question I'm going to ask, but it's very easy. And that's, where can people find you if they want to, email you to ask a research question or talk about taking a class or any other thing?
Yeah, so I teach at Cornell University, and there's my email, aa376@cornell.edu, and reach out. Yeah.
And do you have an academia page?
There is one, which I don't really curate. It was a friend of mine who somehow did this, and so it doesn't really look great. But I mean, if you're interested in something, and I'm happy to send you scans of things that I wrote. If you want to read something, let's say, right? But I don't have a website. I'm a little bit old-fashioned in that respect.
It's okay. It's a very classics archaeology, art history thing to be like, I'm not on socials. I don't have anything. Just use my email. Don't worry. So we will make sure to put your email in the show notes. So if people would like to contact you, they can. Thank you so much for coming and talking with me today. I mean, it was so fun.
No, you were amazing. I mean, I really would love to continue to chat.
So would I. Well, you know what? We'll have to have you back on the show at some point then.
Okay, wonderful. Super.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.